He stood at the edge of conquest. The enemy capital burned in the distance, its cries echoing across the plain like a requiem. His war council waited for the final command. Victory absolute and irreversible was his. Resting gently beneath his fingertips like the hilt of the sword, he refused to draw. And yet, he did not move. History remembers the victors. It remembers the slain. But it rarely remembers the man who stepped back from the edge, who held the power to change the world and quietly let it slip through his hands not out of weakness, not out of fear, but because he saw something no one else could, the terrible cost of triumph. His name was Flavius Aemilianus, though no marble bust bears his face, no triumphal arch carries his name. He was born into the dying days of an empire already cracking under its own weight. He came of age not in a Rome of philosophers and poets, but in a fractured dominion where generals made emperors and emperors made war. Flavius was no idealist. He understood violence intimately. He had seen cities starve before they surrendered, women auctioned in victory squares and children crying over fathers mutilated in the dust. He had orchestrated campaigns across the Danube and held fortresses deep in Parthian lands. His rise was not by chance, it was calculated, precise, and bathed in blood. And yet, the final war broke something in him. It began as all wars do, with pretense. The eastern provinces, long restive under imperial taxation and religious coercion, erupted after a minor governor desecrated a Zoroastrian shrine. Retaliation was swift, brutal, and foolish. Legions marched east under banners of vengeance, demanding submission from people who had long ceased to believe in Rome's gods or its justice. Flavius led the Second Army. By the time he crossed the Euphrates, the land was already red with grievance. He found not an army awaiting him, but villages emptied in fear. He took cities not with resistance, but with silence. But deeper he marched, the more he wondered whether he was chasing a ghost or being led into a grave. But then came the turning point. Arbela, a massive army, born from alliance among rebellious provinces and local kings, confronted him. The battle was ruthless. Over 30,000 men died in a single day. Flavius was victorious, but when he walked the field afterward, stepping over spears and shattered ribs, he saw not the face of victory, but of consequence. The wind blew through the open mouths of the dead. He returned to his tent and did not speak for 3 days. Rome celebrated the battle. Statues were ordered in anticipation of his triumph. The Senate prepared decrees of land and title. But Flavius sent no messenger. He did not march forward. He did not march home. Instead, he waited. The army grew restless. The officers pressed him. The path to the enemy's capital lay open. The rebel king had fled. The war could end. But Flavius did not move. Not because he doubted the ease of victory, but because he had begun to question what victory meant. What happens after you burn a capital? After you destroy the enemy's way of life so thoroughly they can never recover? Do you truly win, or do you merely inherit their ghosts? This was not compassion. It was calculation. He understood that another conquest would require another generation to police. That those who rose from the ashes would not bow, they would wait. And he had begun to see the Roman Empire for what it had become, a machine that turned victory into ash, people into fodder, and emperors into myths built upon graves. So Flavius sent word not to his emperor, but to the enemy king. Not a threat. A proposal. A truce. The message shook both worlds. Rome called it treason. The rebels called it deception. But Flavius met the king under an old olive tree on the edge of the Tigris. No guards. No ceremony. Just 2 men who had lost too much. Their agreement was unheard of. Neither side would claim victory. The capital would stand. The temples would remain. In return, the East would cease hostilities and return trade and tribute to Rome. The people would be allowed their gods. The king would rule in name, but Rome would hold his heir as guarantee. It was peace, but it tasted like smoke to the Senate. The emperor recalled Flavius, demanded explanation. Asked why he threw away conquest. Flavius answered simply, because winning would have cost us everything. The emperor was enraged. Flavius was stripped of command, his statues never carved, his name struck from official rolls, but the Bordeaux remained quiet. Trade resumed. The generation of Romans and Easterners grew up without war. Years later, a new emperor would credit this quiet period for the economic and cultural revival of the late empire. Historians would name it the Eastern Peace. But the man who forged it had long retired to obscurity, living in a house of stone near the sea, visited only by winds and memories. And still, he questioned himself. What if he had marched forward? What if he had taken the capital, crushed the rebellion, and secured Rome's supremacy for another century? What if restraint was weakness? But then he remembered Arbela, the way the sun fell on the corpses, the smell of metal and meat, the silence that followed victory, and he would whisper to no one in particular, "There is no glory in ending what should never have begun." In time, the name Flavius Aemilianus passed into obscurity, not erased, but simply forgotten, as inconvenient men often are. He did not publish memoirs. He did not train apprentices. He did not die in battle, or in the Senate, or in the stories told to children beside hearths. But his choice, like a stone in water, rippled across generations. At the frontier towns once defined by unrest, markets opened. Instead of garrisons, there were merchants. Instead of banners, signs in multiple languages, inviting trade. A new generation grew up without memories of siege walls or ration lines. In the hills east of Edessa, one could hear 3 tongues spoken before midday: Latin, Aramaic, and Greek. The scars of war remained, but they no longer bled. Flavius would hear whispers of this, now and then. A courier would pass through his coastal village, boasting of new roads being built. Fishermen would speak of Eastern fabrics appearing in local markets again. Once, a travelling scholar even came to his doorstep, asking if he was that Flavius. He said no. Instead, he asked the scholar about the eastern cities. Were they rebuilding? Was the capital still standing? Yes, the man said. And their libraries are full again. Their children laugh. It is a miracle, really, that no conqueror burned them. Flavius only nodded. But not all was well. Far from the eastern frontier, the Senate grew restless. The peace starved them not of wealth, but of glory. Senators who had once praised Flavius' brilliance now dismissed him as weak, unambitious. What kind of general retreats from victory? What kind of man leaves his enemies breathing? One man's restraint was another man's betrayal. So, they rewrote the story. Official accounts now claimed that disease had broken the eastern armies, that the rebellion collapsed under its own weight, that Rome had allowed the king to remain as an act of mercy, not compromise. Flavius was not mentioned at all. In the Senate, silence is sharper than slander. One man, a rising star named Varian Scaevola, built his entire reputation on the ruins Flavius had chosen not to make. He toured the eastern provinces, declaring that only Roman strength had brought peace. He commissioned monuments, wrote speeches, and whispered that had he been in command, the East would now be fully Roman. He was ambitious, charismatic, and, in Flavius' opinion, dangerously empty. Years passed. Then, one winter morning, a knock on Flavius' door. It was not a courier. It was a soldier, young, nervous, carrying a letter sealed with imperial red. The wax was smudged from sweat. He held it like a curse. Flavius read it in silence. The Eastern peace was breaking. The king he had once met beneath the olive tree was dead. His son, fully Romanized, schooled in Latin rhetoric and Roman laws, was being rejected by his people. Riots broke out. Trade routes were cut. The boy had begged Rome for help, and Rome, naturally, had sent Varian Scaevola, not to restore peace, but to finish the conquest that Flavius had once refused. It was now, they said, a matter of principle. The old general stood in his doorway for a long time, wind from the sea tugging at the hem of his robe. He folded the letter slowly, returned it to the soldier, and closed the door. Inside, he sat by the fire and said nothing. He knew what would happen. Rome would march with banners high and memories short. They would burn what had been spared. They would break what had been rebuilt, and in the rubble they would carve their name. The soldier did not leave. The 3 days he waited outside the cottage, not because he had orders, but because he hoped. He had grown up hearing rumours about Flavius Aemilianus, that he had once ended a war with a single meeting, that he had saved a kingdom by refusing to conquer it. The 4th morning, Flavius emerged. He said only, "You'll need a better horse," and a quiet mouth. They left before sunrise. The empire was different now. It spoke the same tongue, wore the same armour, but it was harder, more brittle. The roads were wider, but less safe. The border towns, less cheerful. Where once he had seen merchants, now he saw patrols. Instead of laughter, murmurs of rebellion. Instead of trade, taxation. He arrived at the eastern frontier, not as a general, but as a ghost. His name was unspoken among the officers and deliberately omitted from official dispatches. But the soldiers, the ones who remembered, or whose fathers had marched under him, they stared in disbelief. Some saluted in secret. Others merely watched in silence, unsure if he was real. Varian Scaevola received him with forced civility. "Aemilianus," he said, rising from his command chair, "you must be very tired. It's a long journey for a man so far removed from duty." Flavius did not respond. He scanned the map on the table. Arrows pointed toward the capital, the very city he had once spared. "They will not surrender," Varian continued. "They see our restraint as weakness. We will show them Rome remembers how to bite." Flavius looked up. "And after you burn it?" Varian blinked. "We rebuild." "No, they rebuild. You leave." Varian smiled, but there was no warmth. "You had your peace, Flavius. Now let us have our victory." That night, Flavius walked alone to the outer camps. He passed rows of young soldiers' boys, really laughing beside fire pits, sharpening blades, writing letters home. He saw himself in their faces. He remembered the first time he had marched to war, full of certainty and stories about glory. He remembered the first time he had seen a man die in front of him, slowly, with eyes wide and afraid. He remembered the silence of Arbela. At dawn, he spoke to the army, not as a commander, as a man. He told them what victory cost, not in gold, not in lines on a map, but in memory, in humanity. He told them about the capital they were about to destroy, how it had rebuilt its libraries, reopened its schools, raised its children in peace. He asked, was it Rome's destiny to destroy the same city twice in one lifetime? The speech was not recorded, that those who heard it never forgot. Some deserted that night. Some threw down their weapons. Others marched anyway. The city burned. Flavius did not stay for the flames. He returned to the coast, slower this time. His joints ached. His vision blurred. He knew he would not make the journey again. The empire did not pursue him. Why would it? He was not a threat. Not anymore. The eastern capital was renamed. Its temples demolished. Its libraries razed. In their place rose marble forums and gold-plated statues of Roman generals. Varian Scaevola was declared a hero. Aemilianus was not mentioned. But the silence did not last. Years passed. The empire praised itself for its strength. Monuments were built. Historians paid in gold to etch the glory of Varian Scaevola into the marble of memory. Paintings showed him on horseback, clean and commanding, beneath banners that had never once touched real blood. But behind the stories, things unraveled. The city that had once stood as a testament to Merceno broken, rebuilt in Roman stone, never truly healed. Its new governor was stabbed in his sleep within a year. Its grain quotas were never met. Its markets never flourished. Rebellion didn't return in armies, but in absences. Workers vanished. Wells ran dry. Families fled in silence. Nothing grew, not crops, not culture, not loyalty. Rome had won, and lost. Back on the coast, Flavius felt none of it firsthand. He was an old man now. His hands trembled when he tried to cut bread. His voice cracked when he recited old lines of Virgil to himself, out loud, as if they might still understand him. He rarely spoke to others. He had lived the kind of life that left few companions. Soldiers feared him. Politicians dismissed him. Poets ignored him. But sometimes, children from the village would visit, pretending they weren't watching him. He let them. Once, a boy asked why he kept a sword by the door if he didn't fight anymore. Flavius said nothing. Then he unsheathed the blade and handed it to the boy. It was dull. Scarred. The edge long since rusted. "This is what victory looks like when it survives long enough," he said. Elsewhere, memory shifted. In secret circles among scholars, dissidents, monks who still copied banned books by candlelight, another version of the story spread. Not the one etched in Varian's monuments, but the older one, passed down in whispers. It said there was once a general who refused to win. They called him the man who left the gate closed. They called him the one who buried his sword. They said he met the enemy beneath an olive tree and chose words over fire. His name wasn't always remembered. But the idea was, somewhere east of the Tigris, a sect of scribes began inserting a strange parable into their schoolbooks. A fictional warlord stands at the edge of a city and, seeing it kneel, turns back and disappears into the desert. The last line reads, "He knew that glory taken too far becomes ash." So he walked away and became the only conqueror who left nothing behind but peace. Then came the unrest. The Eastern peace reborn in conquest fractured again. This time, not from rebellion, but collapse. Grain stopped arriving. Rivers changed course. The trade routes dried like veins drained of blood. Rome sent new legions, new governors, new threats. They didn't work. The East no longer feared them. Because the East had remembered what peace could look like, and they knew Rome no longer offered it. Word of this failure reached this capital. At first, it was ignored, then suppressed, then twisted. But one senator, old, tired, and no longer interested in pleasing emperor, stood in the Curia and said plainly, "Perhaps we should have listened to the man who refused to win. Because now we have learned how to lose forever." The chamber fell silent. A week later, the senator was found dead in his garden. Natural causes, they said. Back on the coast, Flavius Aemilianus felt the tide pulling. He could not write any more. His hands betrayed him. But in the quiet of early morning, he would stare at the sea and remember each face he had not killed. Every child who lived because he walked away. Every temple still standing. Every poem still being sung in languages Rome never understood. He did not regret his choice. But sometimes, in dreams, he stood again on the battlefield Abila. Except this time, the corpses rose. They were not angry. They were not violent. They simply stood and stared. Thousands of silent men, with wounds still open, eyes still wide. They didn't ask why he had let them die. They asked why he let others live. He always woke before he could answer. One night, the village awoke to bells. No one remembered having bells. They were small, delicate. Somewhere far, perhaps from a fishing boat or a ship lost in the fog. But the sound was clear, measured, almost ceremonial. The next morning, Flavius Aemilianus was found sitting by the sea, wrapped in his cloak, head resting gently on his chest. The sword was still by the door, the house still silent, and in his lap, a scroll no one had seen before. No name, no seal, only a single phrase written in careful, shaking Latin, "There is a victory that leaves no ruin." Only silence. The empire carried on. Rome did not mourn him. No funerals were held. No ashes honoured. But in a forgotten monastery, east of the border, a novice monk drew a man in robes standing before a gate. The gate is open, but he is walking away. Above him, a simple inscription. Flavius, the one who chose Lysander, left more. The man who refused to win faded not into nothing, but into myth. And myths are hard to kill. Even as his name was erased from annals and stripped from plaques, the idea of Flavius lived on in fragments, in footnotes, in contradictions too inconvenient to explain. Somewhere between a ghost and a heretic, he haunted the margins of Rome's own story. It began subtly. A line in a legal code that referenced an unnamed military magistrate who declined final engagement due to ethical imperative. A fragmentary poem discovered near Alexandria, speaking of the man of the closed hand, whose silence was sharper than war. And then, years later, something stranger, a rebellion that quoted no god, raised no standard, and spilled no blood. It emerged in the eastern provinces, not with swords, but with refusal. Farmers who wouldn't pay taxes not out of greed, but grief. Labourers who rebuilt temples that Rome had burned, not because they believed, but because they remembered. Merchants who reopened forbidden trade routes and called it restoration, not rebellion. And a name passed among them not loudly, not defiantly, but like a prayer, Aemilianus. The empire responded as it always did, with force. But this time, the force landed like a fist in water. Nothing held. Nothing resisted. And nothing broke. The rebels would not fight, but they would not obey. They did not storm castles, but neither did they report to garrisons. They did not burn tax offices, but neither did they step inside them. It was not war. It was withdrawal. And Rome, for all its legions and laws, had no answer for that. Far from the shifting east, deep within the libraries of Antioch, a young scribe named Iastus came upon a peculiar bundle, a scroll without title, written in a hand uneven and aged. It spoke not of conquests, but of consequences, not of empire, but of impermanence. You read the entire scroll before realizing the name Flavius Aemilianus never appeared. Only the pronoun he. But it was unmistakable. The scroll described a commander who had faced the open city gates and chosen not to enter, who had spoken of mercy, not as weakness, but as strategy, who had warned that every burned city added only ashes to an already choking world. Iastus, trembling, copied the scroll by hand. He didn't tell anyone. Not at first. But months later, when he travelled north to Caesarea to study rhetoric, he shared it with another student. Then another. And another. And in time, they named themselves the Order of Restraint. Not a cult. Not a movement. Just a quiet thread of men and women who believed that power was most dangerous when used reflexively, and that the greatest triumph was to choose when not to triumph. Rome, of course, noticed. Whispers of this order reached the Senate. At first, they laughed. Then, they outlawed the scroll. Then, they tried to trace its source. But like all things rooted in silence, it proved impossible to grasp. Every time they destroyed one copy, another would surface. Every time they jailed one teacher, 10 more emerged quiet, patient, gentle-eyed men and women who spoke softly of history, cause and effect, and the architecture of human ruin. And still, Flavius' name remained unspoken. Because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the space he left behind. A century later, Rome burned. Not from the east, but from within. No army marched on its gates. It collapsed under its own hunger, its monuments outlasting its citizens, its glory outlasting its governance. The East, meanwhile, fractured but endured. New kingdoms rose, blending Roman, Persian, and local traditions. Cities that Flavius had once spared now bore new names, new faiths, and new philosophies, but somewhere in their bones, they remembered. They remembered the general who could have destroyed the man didn't. And in remembering, they built something different. Not better, but wiser. Centuries passed. The world changed. Languages. Kings gave way to presidents, emperors to parliaments, scrolls to screens. But still, the story flickered. In a medieval chronicle misfiled in a French monastery, a passage about a Roman who chose not to conquer. In a mosque library in Kurdistan, an illuminated manuscript depicting 2 men beneath a tree, neither kneeling. In a university thesis in Berlin, a footnote about an unnamed general whose absence explains a period of peace no textbook can quite account for. Flavius remained a ghost in the record, but some ghosts refused to fade. One winter in the modern day, an archaeologist named Dr. Elenadano uncovered a sealed jar near the ruins of ancient Edessa. Inside was a bundle of papyri rotted, fragile, illegible to most, but she read Latin. And over months of painstaking translation, a name emerged. Not at the top, not in salutation, but buried in a passage describing an anonymous peace treaty. At the insistence of the general Flavius Aemilianus, who declined full victory in pursuit of enduring equilibrium, she stared at the line for a long time. She cross-checked it. No record in modern literature. No accepted mention of a Flavius Aemilianus in imperial rolls. But the evidence was real. The ink cold. The syntax authentic. The paper dated. She published the finding in a minor journal. No one noticed, except one graduate student who had once heard his grandmother speak of the general who left the gate closed. And so it began again. Centuries dissolve the details. Wars are reduced to dates. Things to busts. And generals stow strategies in textbooks. But Flavius Aemilianus defied all three. He was never reducee, because he was never fully included. And so he lingered. Not as a statue in a square, but as a splinter in the minds of those who asked the question, what if we stopped before it was too late? In a modern war college in Ankara, a professor posed that very question to a room of officers in training. He didn't mention Flavius by name. Chios told the story, a Roman general, victorious, standing at the gates and turning back. The class scoffed. One cadet asked, "Isn't that cowardice?" The professor didn't answer. He only wrote a word on the board. Sustainability. That same evening, one of the cadets found herself unable to sleep. She searched archives, forums, even speculative history blogs. She found fragments, a mosaic from Mesopotamia, a banned manuscript in early church records, a prayer from a pre-Islamic poet that praised the man who left no enemies behind. Nothing conclusive, but nothing deniable either, and it stirred something. Elsewhere, a Nido worker distributing food in a conflict zone carried a small pendant etched not with a cross, nor a crescent, nor any emblem of nation or creed. Just a circle, open at one side. When asked, she said, "It's the gate left closed. Religious? No. Ethical." In a private meeting at the United Nations, during a debate over a military intervention, a delegate stood up tired, underpaid, outnumbered, and read a passage from a recently translated papyrus. He didn't mention its name. But he ended with a quote, "To preserve what you love, sometimes you must not take what you can, even if it kneels before you." The room fell quiet. The resolution failed. There was no war. At least, not that year. Even as global empires rose against some digital, some doctrinal, some draped in old flags, there were whispers in think tanks, ethics seminars, documentary sidebars, and slow-burning historical novels. They said history was full of wars fought. But what about the wars not fought? What about the generals who never drew the final line? Could they be heroes too? Or something rarer, something too fragile for glory? One evening, a young historian stood on a TED stage. She opened not with slides, but with a question, "Who's the most powerful person you never heard of?" The audience chuckled. She jibbed. She told them about a Roman general who had the world at his feet and chose to let it stand. She showed satellite images of modern cities that may never have been rebuilt if he'd chosen differently. She listed philosophers from 5 cultures who, across time, echoed his silence in their own words. And she ended with a simple image, a man standing at an open gate, not walking through, just watching, then turning away. The video went viral. Not instantly, not with explosion, but like all things true, it spread slowly, stubbornly, into cracks between outrage and cynicism, into spaces where people were tired of war being inevitable. And in classrooms, lectures, and finally, on streaming platforms, a new question emerged. Is restraint a form of action? At last, the name Flavius Aemilianus returned, not with trumpets, not with fanfare, but on the lips of artists, activists, generals, and students who found themselves at gates of their own. He was called The general of silence, the architect of absence, the strategist of mercy, the one who refused to win his face, remained unknown. But maybe that was the point. Because it was never about who he was. It was about what he did not do. At the edge of a city in ruin somewhere in a desert that had changed names and borders too many times to count, a plaque was discovered half buried beneath sand. It read, "To the one who left us standing. We remember." No signature. Just dust, and the faintest scent of olive trees on the wind.